Provost's Distinguished Graduate Student Lecture Series. Our speaker today is going to be Tarun, Banerjee. The subject is Media, Movements, and Taxes. I will say a very clever measurement and finding about the role of the Tea Party and its the relationship between the Tea Party, its mobilization, and media coverage. Tarun.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to Raina and to Dean Tabor and others who've organized this. I'm very pleased to be here. It really should be me introducing Michael. It's sort of perverse that Michael is introducing me, but that's all right. I'll take it. So,
I didn't do the research.
Not in this case, but in general. In general. So, this is generally, sort of from what I've heard from people, great findings in a terrible paper. Great findings in a terrible paper. But hopefully then in a great presentation, because this is not a paper. So what we are going to talk about is the Tea Party, which you guys know. So we're going to be talking about social movements. We're going to be talking about the media and how they relate to each other here. So I have a couple of questions, as most talks begin with. And the first is on the level of a case. What explains the Tea Party movement? It's very simple. It's an empirical question. We know this phenomenon began and it seemed to burst and flurry on the scene. What explains it? Well, the second question is probably a little bit more interesting. It's certainly more sociological, and that's a theoretical one. And that is, well, what does the Tea Party as a case tell us about how movements work? What can we extrapolate from this one particular case? And I want to take a subset of that to just focus on this talk on the media specifically, which is what role do the media play in movements? So these are the basic questions that are motivating this talk that I'd like to keep us tuned to. Now, the Tea Party, as you guys know, burst on the scene in about early 2009. January, February, this one guy gives a talk on CNBC, and suddenly everybody seems to get very excited, and it just bursts. And before you know it, I want my America back is the big slogan. Obama had just been elected, but at the same time, it seemed like we had the biggest right-wing mobilization in quite a while. That's an interesting kind of thing. And by the end of just about 18 months, we had hundreds of protests by people under the banner of the Tea Party, thousands of local chapters established, hundreds of thousands of participants taking part in various forms, including going out onto the street. Hundreds of thousands of people on the street attending rallies, protesting something or the other under the banner of this movement. And when we look at surveys, millions of people who registered themselves as supporters of this movement. And so something happened, and we need to understand what it is that happened over the course of just a few short months. Now, looking at the media and movements, there's a very simple set of questions we can ask. And the first one is, what is the relationship between media coverage and social movement mobilization? And the very first simplest question is, how does media coverage aid or dissuade social movement mobilization? Which is to say, under what circumstances, what media, what types of media, in which positions do aid the mobilization of a social movement? Correspondingly, we just had the reverse question, which is, what role does the mobilization of a movement itself play in the coverage that it gets? We put the two together, we get this extremely complicated thing that just says, is there a recursive relationship? Is this a relationship that goes back and forth? That's at the very basic level at which I want us to look at this and see what we can find. So let's start with the first one, which is, what role does the media play in movement mobilization? And we talk about that, well, let's first ask, what is mobilization? And it's sociology, so the answer is lots of things. Lots of things are mobilization, anything from knocking on doors, forming an organization, organizing a community in ways that are not always very clear, and also just going right out, making a noise, creating demands, trying to get yourselves heard. So mobilization is doing the kinds of things that need to be done to get the kinds of things that you want, broadly speaking. So that's mobilization. And to pin this talk down, we're going to look at protests for a few particular reasons. First, protest activity is one of the most salient parts of a movement. When we look at the Tea Party, in fact, we find that almost 500,000 people took part in protests over the course of the first 18 months of President Obama's election. That's a very large number of people, right? To get somehow or the other out onto the streets and say something. So that's an interesting thing. Secondly, when we want to look at the media, we also want to know what the media can figure out. And in a sense, the media aren't really going to be able to cover things if they don't know that they're happening. And so protests are sort of the best test case to understand what the relationship can be, because they are public. That is, in a sense, the essence of what a protest is trying to do, as opposed to organizing, which may or may not be public. It may be, in fact, be very secretive. So protests are both a very evocative case for us to see, specifically because of the Tea Party, and also because of the relationship that they can have with the media. So this is the level at which I want to talk about mobilization. If we're going to ask, what effect does media coverage have in mobilization? Well, it's a very simple kind of methodological thing. We need to know what else has an effect on mobilization, just to sort of fit our model correctly. And there are lots of things, but I want to talk about just a few for now, a few sort of key things that we can pin on. These are internal membership, the second is professional organizer, and the third is media coverage. So let's go through them. These are very sort of basic level at which I think is useful to understand. So the first, internal membership strength. The idea here is when we're trying to understand what makes a movement tick, what makes it successful and get out there, we need to look at the base of the movement. We need to look at what's going on at the bottom. What are the local grassroots, quote unquote, people doing, and what role do they have? So this perspective would argue that they're the most important ones. That makes a lot of sense. It's a social movement, so it is something that is organizing outside power channels, and so we would expect that those that are more at the base of a movement are the ones that would drive the movement. And correspondingly, it then believes that if we look at those that have more power, elites, for instance, that they have an effect of demobilizing a movement. And there are a lot of movements for which this is most definitely true. The most famous one of them, certainly I think in American sort of public knowledge and in sociology as well, is the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, of course beginning earlier than that, where a number of studies, including McAdam and Morris, who were both of Stony Brook fame, look at these movements and describe, and Michael students, and describe that the biggest impetus for what drives this movement to radically change the power structure in which they existed at the time was driven from within. It was not from sort of the big, most famous funders and donors and most famous visible faces, for instance, but it was the local black churches. It was local chapters of the NAACP and such. It wasn't the Martin Luther Kings and all, though of course they were very famous and very influential, but it really was the actors at the base of the movement that drove them. That's the first one. The second is the professional organizer model, and that kind of is the opposite side of it, and that's the one that emphasizes how you need to professionalize things. And so this is the approach that says, well, we need to look at how these guys are getting things done in a more organized kind of way. How do they get paid staff, for instance, and how do they channel them? They then talk about the support that elites can have. And so elites from this perspective, are actually very, very essential and helpful to a movement. And this is an important one to talk about here because it's something that people tend to suggest is very characteristic of conservative movements or of right-wing movements. And of course, the Tea Party would qualify, generally speaking, as one of these two. And if we look at a lot of research on movements such as the Christian right, the anti-communist movement, McCarthyism, research really does strongly suggest that when we look at their mobilization, it is driven by what we kind of call more insider tactics, which is to say by channels of funding, channels of organization that are from the top down, so to speak. So that's the second general approach against which I juxtapose the first one. And then let's talk about media coverage. Well, media coverage we can understand has an effect on mobilization. Why? Well, if you can get yourself covered out there, it says something about how influential you are, in a sense. If a tree falls, no one hears it, doesn't make a sound. It's that kind of a simple argument. And the idea is, it has this cultural resonance. Second, it has a very practical element of spreading your message. Social movements, generally speaking, don't have as much resources or time as they would like. And so if they can get their message sent out via the media, for instance, well, that can really help them. That can help them get their message. And of course, in a more direct way, the media may even be very sympathetic to the movement. So this is a third kind of way. And we look at a lot of research on a lot of movements. This has also held true. So Koopmans, for example, has done a lot of research on this. And one of his most interesting cases is on anti-immigrant movements in Germany in the early 1990s, anti-asylum movements specifically. And he finds how the large sort of bulk of the activity of what happened there, which were attacks against asylum seekers, for instance, was almost entirely explained by the way it was framed by the media, which is to say movement attacks by the right in this case that weren't actually against asylum seekers were picked up for reasons that he explains as anti-asylum attacks. And he says that that alone led to a big switch in the emphasis that this far-right faction in Germany had, where they then switched from what they were doing and then basically started attacking asylum seekers big time. So much so that the attacks increased 200, 300-fold. That's a very large degree. So that's the mechanism by which we would expect something like this to happen. Now, I want to explore just that very simple question through the case of the Tea Party. And I am looking at the first 18 months of President Obama's election because this was the time during which most of the activity happened, and this is the time for which I've been able to get data. So that's great. And I built a database using stuff that others have collected and add to it for mobilization of this movement and try and run a number of statistical analyses on them. My dependent variable, which is what I'm trying to explain, is the number of people protesting that come out, but I try and disaggregate that a bit, and I disaggregate it by state, and I also take a longitudinal approach, which is trying to explain this change over time, and I do that by each week. So I look at all 50 states, take out DC, and I take out DC because it doesn't exactly tell us what's going on locally, because we know there have been a few very major marches on DC, including the 9/12 rally, which was Glenn Beck's rally, you guys might know, that took place in DC. So taking that out, I have a database of about 576 protests with just under 500,000 participants. Now, in trying to operationalize this model, we have the three things that I'm looking for: internal strength, professional organizer, and media coverage. And I operationalize them like so. For internal strength, I look at the amount of local chapters of the Tea Party that existed in every state. And I also looked at the number of members on online websites of 6 major websites of Tea Party groups, such as Tea Party Nation, 1776, you guys might know, ResistNet, these are the most famous and largest ones. So I take 2 measures of what I would consider to be mobilization of sheer numbers of people. And then I'm trying to get a sense of how we can tap into support that they have somewhat from more above. You guys might know Michelle Bachmann began the Tea Party caucus, which is an official caucus in the House of Representatives that now has about 50-something members of them. So I look at these members and trace their fundraising, and I look at that and say, well, that's just, it's a proxy, but it's a proxy that might tell us a little bit about how much money they might conceivably be able to get for either the Tea Party group specifically or for their cause, generally speaking, since they are aligned with them. And then for media coverage, what I did was I looked at state and local newspapers, and I looked at about 200 of them, and I kept it to state and local and not national because I want to, again, tie the connection between media coverage to mobilization in a specific area. So if we look at the New York Times, for instance, the New York Times, no doubt, has a big influence, but we don't know what that is. We can't measure it in terms of disaggregating it between different areas, or at least I can't. So I keep that out, and I look at a whole bunch of local and state newspapers. So pretty much everything that isn't the New York Times in New York, I included. Now, for protests, I said this is my outcome variable. I look at the number of people. Now, both my measure of media coverage and protests vary by state and by time, because we can see how much coverage changes, and coverage, of course, is a very current thing. And I use a week as my time period. And I think it's a good measure because a day or two is very short. It sometimes takes a while for the media to talk about something. And anything more than a week is probably too long, since we can't really pass out the effect of which comes first. So I look at a week. Now, when we're doing that, what that means is two of my main variables that I'm trying to explain, media and mobilization, vary both by state and by time, right? So let's look at my state, for instance. What that means is we want to understand what's happening in these states, and we want to explain the difference between these states. So we want to be able to say, what is the influence of variable A on variable B between these two states? If one state has a certain amount of this and another state has more, what does that do? At the same time, we also have information over time. So we can also say, well, let's just look at New York right now. What happens to New York over time? So what happens to newspaper coverage within just this one state? As it increases, what happens to mobilization and such? So this is something that's called mixed effects, which is a way of looking at effects that are both between a case and within a case over time. And this is the analysis that I do since my two main variables vary in both of these cases. All right, so let's get to some simple results. So these first four measures here are my measures of Tea Party mobilization. The first three are my measures of what I would call the internal strength, which is local chapters and membership. And the third is an interaction that I created, which is looking at the effect when both of these are highly present, which is to say sometimes a certain thing may not have an effect just by itself, but it may in tandem with other things. So it may be that when we're trying to look at mobilization in terms of getting out in the streets, it makes some sense that the two of these could work together. If you have the chapters there and the people who are members, you can use these chapters to then get those members out on the street. So that's what this third variable there is looking at. The first idea here that comes across is that none of these are significant. And I indicate that by putting these little stars here, which are measures of significance. And this is a very simple kind of statistical idea. One star, at the very least, you're always hoping for. It signifies that you can be about 95% confident in your results. 2 stars say you can be 99% confident in your results. So you can never truly know, since these are just numbers after all, and a lot of it depends on your models. But what this does tell us that, generally speaking, we can be pretty sure that these have no effect whatsoever. Now, the other ones do, and let's look at what the size of the effect is, for instance. So the Tea Party caucus fundraising actually has an extremely small effect. Now, how we interpret this is a doubling of the amount of this variable increases our outcome variable by that many times. So this, in a sense, is basically for Tea Party caucus fundraising. It's an effect, but it has very little strength to it. 0.001%, it really is not meaningful for us. On the other hand, if we look at newspaper coverage, we find an extremely high effect. And high effect now both between state coverage and within state coverage. Now what that means is if we look at two states that have different levels of coverage, increasing that coverage in one state, doubling it, in fact, has a 240-time fold effect. Now, these numbers should not be taken literally, especially at this high level. They don't actually mean 240 times. It means many times over, which is how I want us to interpret it. And at the same time, within state says doubling it from 1 week to the next also increases our mobilization many times over. Now, this second finding is important, and it's important because when we're looking at within-state variation over time, we're in effect controlling for all the things that are different between states. Now, New York and Texas, and New York and Illinois or California, which actually is one of the major places where we see a lot of mobilization, we can't truly compare them, but we can compare California to itself and see what the effect of coverage is on California when coverage within California changes. So this is a good thing for us to be able to tell that we can get by looking at mixed effects. So the basic story here is quite simple. First, it's to be mentioned first that pretty much no measures of mobilization are significant. And the only measure that is not truly a measure of movement mobilization, it's to measure movement support, and it still is very weak. And instead, we find the media have an extremely high and strong effect. That's the first part of the story. So we can say pretty confidently that media coverage is a strong influence on social movement mobilization. What about the second one? What effect does social movement mobilization therefore have on media coverage? This here is a graph that looks at the relationship between attendance at protests versus coverage in newspapers. And I multiplied coverage by 1,000 just so we can see it. Okay? And I've done this by number of weeks, where week 1 is the first week of 2009, week 52 is the last week, and so 53 is then the beginning. And you can see, first of all, they go hand in hand, generally speaking. So we are getting that kind of an impression that does say that, yes, these do seem to support each other, but let's find out exactly how. So we want to figure out then what else explains media coverage besides mobilization. There are 3 little things that I want to touch upon. Larger protests, organized mobilization, and political successes. So larger protests, it makes a lot of sense, which is to say, if you can get a lot of people out there, you can signify this is worthy, it's newsworthy specifically, and you can do something with it. At the same time, the media can look at this and say, well, this is something that we should probably cover. If we can get a whole, nice picture of a whole bunch of angry people, let's say, out in the street, we should probably cover it. So if you can get more people out onto the streets, you can get more coverage. It's a very simple argument. The second, sort of reflects, taking the resource kind of mobilization approach, says, yes, but what really matters is what you can do outside there. If you can organize behind the scenes, so to speak, if you can use your resources well. So Stagenborg, for instance, did a study of the pro-choice movement, and she said that what was very important there in the movement getting coverage was in their use of paid activists and staff members to spend time, spend money, build connections with reporters, and put in sort of the organizational infrastructure in to then get the story out. So not just this thing of what goes out there in the streets, but kind of what's going on in meeting rooms and that kind of a thing. So that's the second approach. The third says that a movement can take advantage of policy successes. So if a certain movement, if they're advocating a certain thing and they're able to get or see success in the political realm, well, that signifies again that their cause has some worth to it, and it can mobilize their own adherents. So you can convince other people, look, we have something that we can do here. And there's a lot of sort of evidence of this in a lot of cases. Amenza and all did a study of social movement events and coverage in the New York Times over the entire 20th century and found that when there would be certain policy successes, coverage would increase regardless of what the movement would do. So that's the third reason why we can expect that. So I do a similar kind of thing where I'm now switching the variables around. Now, since these are time sensitive, we can look at which direction the effect goes in by changing which comes first in terms of the time. So I find again, yes, protests do seem to explain coverage, just as we expected coverage to explain protests. But again, if we look at the size of the effect, it's actually quite interesting. It's extremely small. It's extremely small both between and within state, where in the first case we had, in this case we have protest activity increases coverage. A doubling of protest activity in this case increases coverage by only 1%. Whereas in the previous case, we had coverage, doubling of coverage increased protest activity by 40 to 240 times. That's a very, very, very large difference. Again, we don't need to take the numbers literally, and we should not. But even if we don't, that's a very big difference. So which is to say, when we look at the relationship, it is one that goes in both directions, but it's very weak. It's extremely weak in this direction. Now, we can accept that, but I don't think we should leave it at that, because it shouldn't probably be this way. When we think about the news, the one thing the news is supposed to do is to tell us what happened, right? The one thing they're supposed to do is to tell us what happened. So if they're telling us what happened, if this happened first, this really should explain this better than this explains this, rather than them telling us what's going to happen, which of course they can't ever do exactly. So that's an interesting thing that I think we do need to get at. And the second reason is when we look at these models, the actual amount of variance explained, which is something called a pseudo R-square, is comparatively small when we try and explain this through social movement mobilization, which tells us again that yes, this relationship is there, but it's not enough. And so I want us to then get at, well, what is it then? And that's kind of where I want us to look at now. And for that, I want us to step out a bit from just a simple kind of rat race kind of thing and look at broader power dynamics around the media. And I want us to look at that in three little ways. The first, since this is a conservative movement, a right-wing movement, I want to look at the role that the right-wing media play here. Second, I want us to look at what powerful actors have to say or might have to say in this and where we can use them to see what their influence is. And third, how that relates to the goals of the movement. So let's look at the first one about the right-wing media. I want to introduce an idea called the echo chamber, which is something that a person named Matthew Brook wrote about. And this is sort of a theory about how the right wing influences the media. The right wing media influences the media at large. So it goes like this. Let's start with an idea that develops in the right wing. Okay? Let's just put it on the left for irony. But okay. Now we start with an idea that develops in the right wing press. Okay? Now what he argues is that what begins in there then gets picked up by a whole bunch of other right-wing sources and gets cited amongst each other. For whatever reason, these are stories that are favorable to them, and so they like it and they pick it up, right? They cite it amongst each other. Now what happens is, as they do that, it starts taking on a little bit of sort of valence on its own, and it gets picked up by the other media, which is to say the mainstream media or the not specifically right-wing media. And then with that, it gets amplified and gets put out there and gets perceived as neutral news. Now, we've seen this in a number of small kind of ways. If you think about, for instance, the idea that Obama is a Muslim, right? That started on the Drudge Report, which is actually, it's a website. It's a very influential website, but it's a very small outlet at the end of the day. That pushes this idea out, gets picked up by a whole bunch of other blogs and right-wing news sources, and before you know it, a couple of days later, CNN, right, as sort of that impartial, big mainstream media source, starts talking about it. So this is basically an explanation of how things start in one area, stay within them, and then go out there. Okay? Now, the second part, how do actors that are powerful fit in? I want to put a simple idea that might not be too controversial, which is that the mass media reflects the ideas and the interests of those that are powerful, specifically the corporate elite. And there are a few reasons for why. So first, when we look at the media, we see that the majority of news media that people receive is put out by large corporations. This is a fact. It has been for many decades, the majority. Second, we look at those who own them. It's again these large corporations. It's been becoming increasingly centralized, which is to say more and more news sources are owned by fewer and fewer corporations. Third, when we look at the source that these news media receive their revenue from, advertising being the major one, the majority of advertising comes from corporations. So that's the third one. And the last, there's another sort of stream of research that looks at the relationship that these organizations and people in these organizations have with corporations at large. And they find that these media organizations are actually central in corporate networks. And there's a whole stream that one could talk about later. So these are some pretty sort of simple, but I think important arguments for why we do need to understand what the corporate interest is when we're looking at the role that the news has. But last, well, what does the movement want? Where do the movement's goals fit in this? Now, what does the Tea Party want? Lots of things. Lots of movement want lots of things. Smaller government, deregulation. I want to focus on lower taxes for now. And there are a few reasons that I won't get into just for the sake of time. But lower taxes, lower taxation is a central part of what the Tea Party movement wants. And we see it at all levels of mobilization in various ways that I looked at. Now, what is this? How does this put together as an argument, right? So, and how does one then test it? So the basic approach I'm trying to take here is to see how this right-wing echo chamber can add up with corporate interests. So we try and figure out what the interests of the corporate media are and see what influence that then has in the coverage of a movement vis-a-vis the actual movement mobilization. So we're going to start at the beginning, right? That little source at the bottom there, when picking a right-wing news source. Now, there are lots of options, as you know, from newspapers, conservative newspapers, to blogs, to cable news. But, you know, at the end of the day, if one were to think about it, there really can only be one candidate. That's Fox News, right? But there are a lot of sort of scholarly reasons for why we should pick Fox News that I won't go into right now. A lot of research that does document the role that they play in right-wing causes that we can talk about later. So I begin by looking at the role that Fox News plays in coverage of the Tea Party movement specifically. Now, I'm returning here to the original, the earlier results that I had about what explains coverage, where we said that protests do explain coverage, but very little. And now I want to see the role that Fox News coverage plays. And I look at Fox News coverage on the Tea Party and in taxation. Now, what I find first by looking at the 3 stars says you have 99.99% confidence. So you're pretty confident about the results. But let's look at the size of the effects. Again, where these were very small, these are in fact extremely large, which is to say doubling the amount of coverage that Fox News has on the Tea Party has way more influence than the actual mobilization of the Tea Party itself on trying to understand when people talk about the Tea Party. And if we look at their coverage on taxation, well, that has the strongest of all. So that's a simple finding, but I think an important finding, because it can be contrasted pretty simply and leads us to ask, well, why is this the case, right? But I want to finish sort of putting this forward as an echo chamber, right? So all I've said here is, well, Fox News has a pretty significant influence on what the rest of the news then talks about in the subsequent week, because this is time sensitive, right? And in other models, I looked at different numbers of weeks, going up to 4 weeks, and the results are almost exactly the same. But it's not an echo chamber if this has the same effect. Then it's just a cyclical effect. So I also then try and test the effect that the broader newspaper coverage in these local and state newspapers has then on subsequent Fox News coverage. So is Fox News then picking up coverage that's happening sort of in all of these local newspapers and then talking about it later? If that's happening, then it's not an echo chamber. It's just a self-reinforcing kind of thing. So this here is the effect that Fox News has on coverage of the Tea Party. It's just a graphical representation of earlier. So doubling Fox News's coverage increases coverage in the rest of these newspapers by 90% in the subsequent week. Switching the thing around, and again, it has almost no effect, which is to say the broader media, what the broader media does, Fox News really doesn't care about very much. It does a little bit. It's a very significant relationship, but the strength is minuscule. It's 0.3% versus 90%. And graphically, this wouldn't even be the case. You wouldn't be able to see it. You wouldn't be able to see 0.3%. So that tells us, yes, it certainly is in one direction. But the echo chamber also says it's an indirect effect, right? It's not just a one-directional effect, but that these things are sort of hidden. They first start off in a place, like the Drudge Report. Most people wouldn't know what the Drudge Report is, but everybody knows the Obama, is a Kenyan idea. So the idea is that it's an indirect effect that gets somehow lost as it gets amplified, and we don't know what its sources are. And I test that by again returning to my first models trying to explain mobilization. This here is the exact same model that I had earlier that showed how important newspaper coverage was and how unimportant movement mobilization was, and I put in Fox News. And it has no effect, which is actually good news for this argument, which is to say, if we just built this model and left it as it was, we would find Fox News actually doesn't have an effect on coverage of the Tea Party. Now that doesn't exactly make sense given just how closely we would identify Fox News with the Tea Party. But if we try and break these apart a little bit, what I find is the effect is an indirect effect, which is to say the strongest predictor of mobilization is coverage in these local newspapers, and the strongest predictor of coverage in these local newspapers is Fox News coverage. the previous week, a couple of weeks before that, and a month before that. So this is an indirect effect that I think is pretty strong in suggesting this echo chamber. Now, how does one get to the idea of corporate interests? If we're saying that corporations have, maybe not a direct, an indirect role in the news, how do we sort of get at them? And I'm looking at the taxation part of the movement, of the movement's goals for a reason. First is, this is a place at which both sides agree. Corporations want lower taxes, the Tea Party wants lower taxes, quite simply put. But at the same time, this is a good place where we can also disaggregate taxes. So if we're thinking about corporations, what do they care about? Well, in terms of taxation, lots of things, but generally speaking, it makes more sense for corporations to be more interested in corporate taxation and the Tea Party to be more interested in either income or property, or all of them equally, let's say, but not corporate taxation specifically, since they are not, they certainly don't espouse to be just a movement, supporting corporate interests. And so what I do then is I look at the effect of taxation that I had earlier. Remember that was the strongest predictor, and then tried and break it up and to say, well, let's look at the different types of taxation. Different types of taxation affect different groups in society differently. And let's try and see, maybe there's a difference there in the influence. And there really is. It's quite interesting, which is to say, this now here is showing us the effect that various coverage on all these different forms of taxation have on coverage of the Tea Party. And we find this absolutely corporate taxation. When we talk about corporate taxation, we then become, in the media, more likely to talk about the Tea Party. But we took a look at any of the other two, and it actually has the reverse effect. So what was, when we had not separated this, just looked like one strong, very strong positive effect. When we break it apart, it actually is one strong positive effect and two strong negative effects. Now this is an indirect measure, of course, but I think it's an interesting measure. Now, and the other way in which I think it's interesting is when we look at the effect that Fox News has, it's only when we look at their coverage on corporate taxation that their own coverage on the Tea Party has no significance. And remember I said that their coverage on taxation and their coverage on the Tea Party were the most important predictors of coverage in the rest of the media. And this is almost 200 state and local newspapers, so not an insignificant measure of the media. But when we break down that taxation to corporate and the other two taxations, it's only when we look at corporate taxation that their own coverage of the Tea Party becomes suddenly non-significant. In the other cases, it remains strongly significant, which is to say, even amongst Fox News itself, their own coverage, it's when they're talking about taxation specifically for corporations that the effect then gets lost in the Tea Party, and that's because I argue, because they're then talking about somewhat similar things. Now, just to sort of conclude with some basic findings. So when we're talking about the Tea Party, we look at the relationship between movements and coverage, right? In this case, we find, yes, the coverage does go in both directions, but it's very strong in one direction and very weak in the other direction. Secondly, it's not the way we would expect it to be. If we expected it to be strong in one direction, we would expect it to be in this direction, which is to say, it's the things that you do, it's when you get thousands of people out on the streets, tens of thousands in some cases, that the media should then cover you next. Instead, it's the other way around. Second, this tells us the influence that the right-wing media has. But we break it down again, it's this kind of indirect effect. It's an effect that's felt both ways again, but much more strongly in one direction than the other. And last, when we look at, try and sort of proxy, right, how the interests of those that are powerful, in this case have direct connections to the media, can be measured indirectly in the coverage of that media, I find that breaking it down to the corporate taxation coverage has a very strong predictor, whereas the others do not. And when we look, finally, what does this mean for movements as a whole? Well, kind of just taking the same thing and saying, well, we understand when we're trying to address what makes a movement tick, it is very important for us to examine the relationship both ways, right? But to take a step out. Because had we not done that, for instance, and had we not tried to connect in an indirect relationship and test these things in different ways, we would have come up with Fox News as having no effect. for instance, or things like that. So I think it's an important thing in this case to take from just this particular movement case to then say, when we're looking at this, well, how do we then try and understand what the dynamics are within the media? So in this case, I'm trying to look at the right-wing media and the media at large, but there are other ways of breaking this down, and then trying to understand what power dynamics are there that both involve the media and that are larger than the media, and how do we test for them. In this case, I tried to do it by modeling the idea that the news media are a corporate news media and therefore would reflect corporate interests. And by interest, I just look at the interest around taxation. It's only one way of doing it. There are many ways of doing it, which I think is the idea sort of going forward of things that can be done. But anyway, in conclusion, I think it's an interesting finding. And when it comes to the Tea Party, the good news of the Tea Party is the news. Now, what does that mean for movements at large? Well, we don't know yet, right? There's no reason why that should hold for other movements, but that's the interesting story, and that's what I think we need to find out. So thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to any questions if you have them. And thank you.